Good morning. It's Dr. Paula again, and I'm going to give you some general information about insects, and then Dr. Joe is going to come and tell you about insects in your garden. So this is Module 9, Insects and Other Garden Pests. Entomology is the study of insects. It's the scientific study of insects. And why do we study insects? Well, there's more than 1 million different species. They're the most abundant species on Earth of all the animals. And then only 1% of them are pests. When we see an insect, sometimes we're immediately thinking about something bad is going to happen, either to us or our plants, but only 1% of them really cause problems. Basic insect classification. In science and in biology, all organisms are placed into categories, and the largest category is the domain, and then those domains include all living things. And then that's broken down into kingdoms, which are those things that have many, many characteristics in common. And then a kingdom, in this case, for the insects, is Animalia, and that's all the animals together. And as you know, there are groupings of animals that have very much similarity, like the birds, the fish. Well, in this case, we're going to talk about the insects. And those subcategories under kingdom are called phylums. And the phylum for insects is called Arthropoda. And that's all arthropods. And these are the characteristics of arthropods. What arthropod means in Latin is jointed foot. So we're going to see how the insects fit into this category. Okay, insects they do not have any internal solid structure like bones to hold their bodies firm. They have an exoskeleton, which is made of chitin, something unlike a thin fingernail. That keeps their body rigid. They have really highly developed sense organs, like antenna, you probably are familiar with. They have jointed limbs, and there we go back to the Arthropoda. They have jointed limbs, so we have jointed limbs. Okay, segmented bodies. If you remember back when you learned in grade school, head, thorax, abdomen is the most common. And then they have a ventral nervous system, which means the nervous system runs along the front of their bodies. In mammals, it runs along the backbone. So it's very different. In insects, it runs along the front of their bodies on the belly side. Okay, bilateral symmetry. That means that there's a left side and a right side that are almost mirror images. For instance, a person can draw one line down the body and you have similar sides. So those are the characteristics and the classification of Arthropoda. Now, even the phylum Arthropoda is broken down into categories of things that have more similarities, and these are called classes. And insects are in the insecta class, right? Okay, they have 3 pairs of legs, 3 body parts, typically 2 pairs of wings, but some only have 1 pair, and some have none. But most typically there are 2 pairs. And they have 1 pair of antennae, and they usually have a pair of compound eyes and some simple eyes. Now, compound eyes are those ones that have all the little facets in them, and simple eyes are just what it says, something very simple. Basic insect classification. This is in US and Canada. Just to give you some numbers, you don't need to remember these. This is just to give you a general idea. There are 28 different orders, families, over 600 families, and that's we've got kingdom, phylum, class, and then order, and then they're broken down into families, over 600 of those, and then those are broken down into how many different genera or genus types, and there are 12,500 of those, and then those are broken down into species, which are 86,000. So we're talking about a lot of different kinds of insects just in the US and Canada, not to mention throughout the world. Okay, most of the insects important to your gardens are in 9 orders. So you don't have to worry about all insects, but these are the most important ones that you're likely to encounter in your gardening. You don't need to remember these from here. We're going to go over these a little bit. But here are just some common examples. Beetles or Coleoptera, earwigs or Dermoptera. So they all have names, and they all end in this P-T-E-R-A, Ptera, which remember we said one of the qualities of insects, one of the characteristics is they have wings. Well, the Ptera means wing, and there's usually some term in the front that has something to do with what type of wing, or even if they have wings. And if you'll notice, they all end in that. So wings are an important characteristic in classifying insects. We're going to start with Coleoptera, which is the beetles, okay? They have 4 wings. Now, if you look at a beetle, you might even think it doesn't have wings. but it has these very hard, the top part is a very hard covering here. But if they need to fly, which they don't often, but they'll move those out of the way, and then out comes this pair of very membranous, almost window pane-like wings. So the first pair is usually long, and it protects the abdomen. They're very hard. Okay, and then there's a pair of, it said the paired wings meet in a straight line down the body. That's one of the things you can use to identify a beetle. These two pairs of hard wings with a straight line down the abdomen. They have chewing mouth parts, so it looks pretty obvious if you look at that they have chewing mouth parts. The next is Dermoptera, and these are the earwigs. Now, if you were just looking at an earwig, you would probably recognize it from the two prongs in the abdomen. But here are the characteristics of the whole order. 4 wings, the first pair thickened and hardened. Now, look at these wings. They have 2 pairs. Look how short they are compared to the beetle. The beetles go all the way down the abdomen. These just stop right here, and there's a harder pair here, and then a more membranous pair underneath. A shorter, there's these little short covers with abdomen having forceps. Okay? And there are, chewing mouth parts. Diptera. That means 2 wings, right? Flies, mosquitoes, midges, and gnats. They only have 1 pair. 1 pair of wings. The second pair is reduced and not seen. It looks like a knob. I don't know if you can see it here, but this is one of those flies that mimics a bee. You might think, well, that's a bee there, but it's not. It's really a fly that has evolved to look like a bee. And it's got 1 wing here and a wing here, so that's 1 pair. And then right behind that will be a little knob that's kind of a leftover structure where there used to be could have been a wing at some point in its history. Okay, it has membranous wings. That means, again, window pane-like, we can see through them. And then piercing, sucking, or lapping mouth parts. And we'll talk about mouth parts a little bit more in a few minutes. Okay, Hemiptera. Hemi means semi, so this is kind of having a half wing, or you might want to look at it that way. Stink bugs, leaf-footed bugs, aphids, and whiteflies. They have 4 membranous wings here, okay? And the front wing's somewhat translucent and thinner with veins in it. And they're held roof-like over the body. Here's a leaf hopper with being held kind of like a little tent over the body. The most obvious, easiest thing for me to recognize Hemiptera is they have a triangle on their back, right here. A little triangle. So if you see a squash bug or something that you might already recognize, you look for that little triangle. And they have piercing or sucking mouth parts. Hymenoptera, and this means thin or window pane-like, okay? The wings are very thin and membranous-like. Now, this may look like it has 1 pair of wings, but there's another pair hiding up in there. If you look at the connecting points, you could follow the other wing, the wing behind up through this way, okay? The hind wings are smaller, so that's why I'm saying they're harder to see. The head is kind of loosely jointed. They can move their head quite a bit, and they have chewing mouth parts. But they don't use them to bite us. Bees sting you. They don't bite you. All right, Lepidoptera, butterflies and moths. 4 large wings. I think that's pretty obvious to most people who looked at butterflies. And they have a siphoning or vestigial mouth parts. This means something that's a holdover from their development. And their siphoning mouth parts is what they uncurl and put in the flower to get the nectar. Neuroptera. These are the lace wings. Here is a nice 2 good pictures of lace wings. 4 membranous wings. You can actually see those. If you look at where the edges end, you can tell there's a pair that ends here and a pair that ends here on each side. It says that the front wings are larger than the hind wings. That's where they're hanging over the shorter wings underneath. Their wings are folded, generally held more flat on the abdomen, and they have chewing mouth parts. Orthoptera. Here's a grasshopper. And if you've never seen it before, grasshopper has a pair of wings that you can see, but when they fly or when they jump and try to move from one place to another, they'll often unfold this fan-like wing that's underneath that you'd never know just from watching a grasshopper move around. They have jumping hind legs, and again, this hind wing opens up kind of like a fan. And they also have chewing mouth parts. Thysanoptera, these are the thrips. These have really interesting wings, okay? They have setae, or fingers, or little, almost feather-like wings. This is the main part of the wing, and they have all these little feather-like structures coming off of them, okay? They have sucking mouth parts. Some of them don't have wings at all. And they have rasping sucking mouth. Rasping just means they kind of scrape along the leaf as they go and eat what they can get. Okay, something that insects have in common is the 3 body parts, and that's what we're going to talk about here, a little bit about all of insect anatomy. This is a bee, okay, so we'll take it as an example. The antenna and the head is just right here. Right behind the head, this segment is the thorax. And in bees, they have a really skinny little waist, and then behind that is the abdomen. And here are the legs, and if you count, there are 6 legs. So this is indeed an insect we have here. Over here is just another view that you can see everything from the side view, the antenna, the head, the thorax, the abdomen, and the wings. And again, 6 legs. And here you can see the mouth parts a little bit better, the chewing mouth parts. Now, this is some insects like the Lepidoptera, butterflies and moths, have a stage where they are a caterpillar. Okay, well, what's the anatomy of a caterpillar and how does that relate? Well, their head is a very tiny front section. Several sections back from that is the thorax and then the abdomen. Now you think, well, how many legs does a caterpillar have? Is it really an insect? But really, the only true legs are right up here in the front, and there are 6. Okay, we just talked about several different kinds of mouth parts and looking at the different orders. And here is just a really great picture of these different types of mouth parts. Chewing, where they can actually grab part of a plant or whatever it is they're eating and bring it into their mouth, chewing it up. Piercing or sucking, they would actually inject this, like this looks a little bit like a mosquito, where it would actually inject into your bloodstream, or if it was a plant, it would inject into the nice tissue, the phloem and the xylem, where the goodies are. Siphoning, this would be like a butterfly would uncurl this into a flower for nectar. And then this would be sponging, like a fly. They actually land and then they kind of sponge around on whatever their substrate is to get the goodies into their mouth. A little review on insect metamorphosis. Okay, just a review. We've all learned this at some point in our lives, but we don't think about this stuff, so let's review it. Eggs. An insect lays an egg. It's in the egg stage for 3 to 4 days, and then out hatches a caterpillar. The caterpillar eats and grows for a couple of weeks, and then eventually goes into pupation, which means it either spins a cocoon if it's a moth, or if it's a caterpillar, it forms a chrysalis, which it stays in for a couple of weeks, and then out will emerge a full-grown adult, which in this case, it doesn't look like a full-grown adult, but these wings will actually unfold and dry, and you'll have this beautiful butterfly sitting on the plant after it emerges. So that's complete metamorphosis. It goes through all the stages: eggs, the egg, the larvae, the pupa, and the adult. There is such a thing as incomplete metamorphosis. And this looks very, very different because there is no pupal stage. That's the biggest difference. The adult lays an egg. The egg hatches and you have this little miniature insect. It's already got its legs, and it looks a little bit like an adult, but you notice that, well, you can't tell really well from this picture, but I can tell you that the wings are not well developed. It doesn't look exactly like an adult. And as it grows, its exoskeleton, which is, I said, it's hard, kind of like a thin fingernail, will have to split open, and they will emerge from that into another stage. This is called molting. They shed their exoskeleton and come out because they're growing and it can't hold them anymore. Okay, so they go through several molts and stages until finally, the 5th molt, they become their true adult. And you can see all the adult features of what that insect really looks like as an adult. There are insects with no metamorphosis. When they hatch out of the egg, they just look like a miniaturized version of the adult. They have all the same features, it's just in a smaller version. Dr. Joe's going to come now and talk to you about insects in your garden and sort of explain why all of this that we talked about matters.
Thank you, Dr. Paula. Now, what you've seen is how insects are classified, the different structures of an insect, the anatomy of the insect, the different orders that you're primarily going to encounter in your garden, and how those are characterized, some major characteristics of those orders. So now I'm going to tell you about some of the damage that these different insects can cause in your garden. These are some examples of typical damage that you will see from insect predation in your garden, your vegetable garden. Of course, everyone's probably seen these. Holes chewed into their plant leaves. A lot of times you'll actually still find the bad guy there, the caterpillar, and this is typical of caterpillar feeding on your plants, especially Lepidopteran caterpillars, Coleoptera caterpillars. Those will all feed like this and chew holes into the leaves. This is damage caused by leaf miners. A lot of times their leaf miner larvae are from flies, and the little maggot, the little caterpillar, is moving between the leaf layers. If you remember from your botany class, the upper surface of the leaf, the lower surface of the leaf, and the interlaminar cells, well, that is where the leaf miner lives, between those two layers, cell layers in the leaf, the upper epidermis and lower epidermis. And it moves around in there, and it's actually quite well protected from predators and from anything you try to do to get rid of it. But this trails, silvery looking trails that just meander and move around through the leaf, that's leaf miner damage. This is damage also caused by chewing insects, and I remember the mouth parts, and this is often described as skeletonized leaves. It's because, as you'll see, what this particular caterpillar has done, and sometimes it's the rasping mouth parts that will also, on insects that do this, is they've eaten all of the leaf tissue between the veins of the leaf. So they're leaving behind, and you see the major vein here, the side veins, and all these small veins branching out. The xylem and phloem tissue, they're leaving all that behind and just eating the leaf tissue. This is called skeletonizing. And another noticeable damage from insects is when the young leaves especially are coming out and they're gnarled and curled and misshapen. This is most often caused by insects that have piercing sucking mouth parts, like aphids and whiteflies and thrips that are feeding on this young developing tissue. As they insert their mouth part into the plant tissue to feed, a lot of times there's some other enzymes that go in there as well, and it will cause the developing leaf tissue to not develop properly, and it'll give you this misshapen, curled, gnarled, and twisted leaves. This is often seen damage caused by insects with piercing, sucking mouth parts, such as mites. Those aren't insects, but they have piercing, sucking mouth parts. And this is called stippling, because what's actually happening is the insect is feeding on the underside of the leaf. And every time it sticks its proboscis or mouth part into the leaf to feed, it kills a few cells. We're just seeing a few dead cells. You really won't notice that. But as they move around on the leaf, multiply and feed, then all the dead cells start to show through the upper side of the leaf. And so it begins to have this termed stippling effect. So if you see something like this on your plant leaves, you can bet that you most likely got insects with piercing, sucking mouth parts feeding on the underside of the leaf. And of course, something like this, you saw this guy earlier, the tomato fruitworm. The insect goes into the fruit, chews holes, moves in, develops inside the fruit, feeds inside the fruit, grows inside the fruit, moves out. This is also typical damage caused by these insects. Now, some of the common insect pests that you're going to encounter in your garden would probably be some of these I'm going to show you. These are Coleoptera garden insect pests. As you can see, Coleoptera, they have the hard outer first pair of wings, and they form this straight line down the back of the insect where they meet. And these hard first pair of wings, the elytra, they cover the second pair of wings underneath, the membranous pair, which is often the ones used for flying. Here's a Colorado potato beetle. Here's a Colorado potato beetle pupae developing, and these are very common in a lot of gardens. They feed on a lot of our garden vegetables, the leaf tissue. Mexican bean beetle. It is a true beetle. And here you see all stages of the Mexican bean beetle. We have the eggs, then we have the young developing different instars of the larvae, and then we have the pupa, and then we have the adult. And you see this pencil tip here, you can see this insect will be readily noticeable on your plant, but these smaller stages, you might not notice that until it starts to do some damage. Mexican bean beetle is very common. Striped cucumber beetle has coleopteran leaf wings, and this one sometimes is confused with insects that you're going to see in our next module, the soldier beetles, because it has a very similar body style and shape, even the coloration, but it's not the same. And these are the bad guys. And here is the larvae of the striped cucumber beetle feeding on the cucumber tissue. Weevils, there's quite a few of those that can be a problem in our gardens. Here we have the vegetable weevil. Here we have the pepper weevil. Weevils are readily identified by the long mouth part sticking out here on the head of the insect. And here are the weevil larvae feeding inside the tissue of the vegetable. And then up here we have several flea beetles that you may notice in your garden. Flea beetles also feed on the underside of the leaf, and a lot of times the upper side of the leaf will have stippling, like we showed you earlier, from flea beetles feeding on the underside. Here we have the crucifer flea beetle, the striped flea beetle, and the hop flea beetle. There's different species of flea beetle, but they all have this very similar appearance. They're not very large. They're about less than a quarter inch in size. They're usually very shiny and roundish, except for this one, which is a little bit longer. But these are the common coleopteran garden pests you would run into. Lepidoptera garden insect pests. These are the caterpillars of some of our more lovely visitors to the garden, butterflies and moths. Butterflies and moths, on the one hand, are great pollinators, but on the other hand, their caterpillars are extremely destructive garden pests. The armyworm is one that a lot of people encounter every year. A lot of times the caterpillar can be distinguished by this V-shaped appearance on its head. Armyworms get their name because they move like an army, destroying as they go. They are usually in large numbers. They climb up the plant, eat the leaves off, move down, and move on until they grow to the point where they're ready to pupate. So armyworm is one you'll encounter. Probably everyone's seen this one at some point, even with corn that you buy at the grocery store. Sometimes you'll find these guys. The corn earworm. The eggs are laid inside the developing ear, and as the larvae grows and matures, it eats away at the kernels inside the ear. Bean leaf roller. Now, the reason it's called a leaf roller is because as the larvae or the caterpillar matures, it'll actually roll up the leaf and wrap it around it like covers. And it spins a web to hold all that together. A lot of times if you see leaves curled up on your plant, especially the older leaves, and it's not the younger leaves, and you start to uncurl them, you'll find the caterpillar on the inside. He's hiding in there, eating, growing, and maturing, and he's just covered himself up with the leaf as he rolled it up to protect himself. Here's the tomato fruit worm that we're seeing again. We've seen the fruit with the holes in it twice already now. And here's the little guy that's doing it. They will totally destroy the fruit on your tomato. There's the tomato hornworm, huge caterpillar. Those guys will get up to 4 inches long. And what's interesting about the hornworm, the tomato hornworm here or the tobacco hornworm, is that they will devour 90% of the leaf tissue that they're going to eat in the last few days of their development. So you'll look at a healthy tomato plant covered with leaves one day, 2 days later you go out there, or sometimes even the next day, and there's no leaf tissue left on it. You may not even find this big guy hanging around anymore. He may have already pupated and dropped to the ground. But what it was is the tomato hornworm or the tobacco hornworm. They are very voracious feeders, large caterpillars. This one, I'm sure everyone's familiar with at some point in their life. There's little nursery rhymes about it. There have been toys made that mimic its action. This is a cabbage looper, also sometimes commonly called an inchworm. They're called inchworms because, as we see here, the front legs, and back here we have the prolegs. As the worm, as the caterpillar moves forward, it'll attach this front legs and then arch its back and pull its back end up to here. And then once this back end is pulled upwards, it'll attach its back legs, release the front legs, and then move forward. And that's how it moves along, arching its back and straightening out and arching its back and straightening out. That's the inchworm. Cabbage loopers are very, very destructive in our vegetable gardens, especially on our cold crops. Cabbage, broccoli, cauliflower, Brussels sprouts. Cabbage loopers can be very destructive. Here's the squash vine borer. I say this one to last to bring out another point, in that the squash vine borer is a caterpillar that is going to feed heavily inside the squash vine stem. And you'll only see it if you cut it open and look, and you can actually find this guy in there. But another thing that some of these predatory insects will do, these garden pests, is they also carry disease with them and transmit diseases. The squash vine borer can actually carry disease and kill your squash vine, not just by its feeding, but by the disease it brings with it. Let's move on to the hemipteran garden insect pests that you may run into. All of these are pretty common in a garden. The stink bug, so named because of the foul odor it gives off when you catch them, but as you can see, remember these are hemipteran insects, and here's that little triangle or diamond-shaped structure that you see on the insect. This is formed by where the wings come together just behind the thorax of the insect. And it's a very, very identifying characteristic for the hemipterans or the true bugs. Here we have the diamond shape. Even on the whitefly, if you look closely where the wings come together, we have that little triangle formed right there. All of these are hemipteran insect garden pests. And aphids, we have the green peach aphid here, we have cabbage aphids here. Usually you'll see these without their wings in the larval form, nymph form, or as wingless adults, but they do have wings at one stage during their life, and they fit into the hemipteran category. But these are all insects with piercing, sucking mouth parts. So they're going to cause destruction by piercing into the plant tissue and sucking out the sap from the plant, and that's how they cause damage. If the population gets really high, they can do major damage to your vegetables. Whiteflies, especially if you walk by your plants and a cloud of white tends to rise from it. Once you brush it, then you have a whitefly problem. Most of these will feed on the undersides of the leaves, so they're protected from the sun and from predators. And so if you want to do any treatments or any control, you have to make sure you get it onto the underside of the leaf as well. This is a leaf-footed bug. As you can see, the hind pair of legs, the last jointed segment, flattens out and expands and actually has the appearance of a leaf. So that's why they get the name leaf-footed bug. These are the nymphs of the leaf-footed bug. And as you'll see later, these are easily confused with assassin bugs sometimes. These, as nymphs and as adults, will feed on your plant and can cause damage. The tarnished plant bug looks a lot like an aphid, but it's not the same. It feeds on this is a nymph feeding on the plant. Here's the adult. So you can see they're quite different. And then there is the squash bug, which we have over here, piercing, sucking mouth parts. And there are some other garden pests. There's the insects that are in the Thysanoptera order. These are the thrips. You see these are very tiny insects. This is the flower thrip larvae. There's the adult. Here's the larvae of the onion thrips. Here's the adult. And they do have the bristle wings, which is very characteristic of the Thysanoptera. And a lot of times the damage that these cause feeding on leaves will be the stippling effect. Flower thrips, they will cause the flowers to abort. They will drop off. If they do open, they will be misshapen. So usually if you have a healthy plant that the buds are dropping off, or as they open they're misshapen, what you want to do is you want to take a look and see if you do have the flower thrips. They are very common. They are very destructive. In the middle here we have the dipteran insect pests. This is the adult vegetable leaf miner fly. This is the larvae. This is the damage it does. Very tiny insect, very tiny larvae, lots of damage. Usually with leaf miners, we don't do any treatment for those because the damage isn't significant enough to cause the plant to lose any production. Now, after we move outside the insects, there are some other garden pests that we want to tell you about. These are the mollusks. They're still in the Animalia family, or kingdom, but the phylum is the Mollusca. A footed, single foot, that's the poda part of the class name. The snails and the slugs. And a slug is essentially a snail without its shell. And what you'll notice with snail and slug damage on your plants, as you can see here with a cabbage plant that's being destroyed by snails, is the damage looks very, very similar to what you would see with caterpillars. Holes are eaten into the leaves of the plant. But now if you do treatment to control caterpillars, and what's actually causing the problem is snails or slugs, then you're not going to get any control at all, because the same material is used to control the Lepidopteran insects or the Coleoptera insect caterpillars will not control snails and slugs. But if you remember, the snails and slugs, if you ever notice, as they crawl along, they leave a slimy trail behind, because it's this slime that they're producing that lubricates their path as they move along the leaf. So a telltale sign that it's slugs or snails causing damage to your plants and not caterpillars is you can see that silvery trail along the leaf. So if you have holes in your leaves like this or like this, and you look closely, especially in the sunlight, and you see this glistening silvery trail that runs along the leaf and up to the holes, then most likely you have snails or slugs causing the damage and not caterpillars. Some other garden pests are the mites. They're related to spiders and ticks. They're arachnids in the arachnida class. They're still arthropods. And most mites, they have an oval-shaped body, and they only have two body regions that may look like they're fused together as one. Most mites, they have piercing, sucking mouth parts, and these are the phytophagous mites and the predatory mites have the piercing, sucking mouth parts. There are some that have chewing mouth parts, but these are primarily mites in stored grain, so you're not going to run into these. And remember, mites have 8 legs, 4 pairs. Insects have 6 legs or 3 pairs. That's one of the big differences you can see just from the outer appearance between the mites and some tiny insects. There are over 7,500 species of plant-feeding mites in the world, and they feed on the leaves, the inflorescence, they feed on the fruits, they feed on virtually every part of your plant with their piercing, sucking mouth parts. Their feeding can cause the stippling, as I talked about earlier. It will cause curling and twisting. It can cause a rusty appearance on developing fruit, such as the rust mite on citrus. They can even cause gall formation because as they're feeding with their piercing, sucking mouth parts, they're injecting enzymes and other things into that wound, and the plant reacts by forming a gall. One of the bad things about mites is that they can transmit plant viruses. Some of the more common ones are wheat streak mosaic virus, fig mosaic virus, tobacco mosaic virus. So as the mite is feeding on your plant, not only is it causing damage, but it's injecting a virus into the plant, which is going to lead to even more harm. And some of the soil-inhabiting mites that feed on your plants and your plant roots will actually spread fungal spores as they feed. One common disease of that is the fungal rot of garlic and onion. That is caused by the spread of fungal spores from mites feeding on the underground portions of the garlics and the onions. Here's some pictures of some of the mites. As you can see, they're very tiny. Measuring here 0.5 millimeter, you can see how small these are. These are citrus rust mites. These are a little different from some of the more commonly pictured mites. They have this tiny head, the legs are up here, and then they have a very elongated bitey portion here. Rust mites can cause a lot of damage on citrus, on the leaves, and on the fruit. Red spider mite, it's obvious how it got its name. When it feeds on plants, it also causes stippling on the plant leaves. And then this one, the two-spotted spider mite. This one is one that's very, very common pest in vegetable gardens. It has a very, very broad host range, and it's very identifiable. Even though mites are very tiny, if you flip over a leaf and you see something and it looks like a little black spot, 2 little black spots, scurrying along on the underside of the leaf, what you're seeing is the two-spotted spider mite, so named because of these 2 black spots on each side of the body. A lot of times with the naked eye, even if you can't see the mite itself, you can see those 2 little spots moving along. So these are some of the mites that are our garden pests. This would be typical damage that you would see from the mites feeding on your plants. These are beans, these are tomato leaves. You see the stippling effect. Very, very common with mite predation on your plant leaves. And spider mites, they're called spider mites because they do actually spin webs that they use to move from place to place. They can even use the spun web to catch the wind and be moved from one plant to another by the wind. That use it like a sail. And so you can't see the webbing here very easily. You can see all these little tiny dots. This is a bean leaf that has a lot of webbing on it, and these are the spider mites moving along that webbing from one part of the plant to the other. So the reason they're called spider mites is that they do form these webs. I think the final category that we have of garden pests are the nematodes. The nematodes, they're thread-like worms. They live in a wide range of environments. They need moisture, but they'll be in soil, in fresh water, in salt water. Just about anywhere that they can have a moist environment, you're going to find nematodes. And there are species of nematodes that feed on fungi, they feed on bacteria, they feed on small animals like protozoans, they will feed on other nematodes, and then there are the plant feeding nematodes, which are the ones that cause damage to our gardens. Nematodes that feed on plants are called the plant parasitic nematodes, and they are in all agricultural soils in one form or another. The most common one that we're going to see as gardeners is the root knot nematode. This is one that is pretty recognizable and pretty ubiquitous. It feeds on a lot of different plants. It's the Meloidogyne incognita is the name of it, and this is what you will see. This is lettuce that the roots have been infected with root knot nematode. This is okra that's been infected with root knot nematode, and this is tomato. And this picture shows you the difference between healthy roots of a tomato plant and the infected roots. So the root knot nematode got its name for obvious reasons. On the okra, you got knots, 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 knots. The roots look like threads that have been tied in knots all along. Tomato, knots, 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 knots. The lettuce roots, you have knots, 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 all along the roots. Here's the life cycle of the root knot nematode that you can look at later if you want. But essentially, there's an egg that's laid. There's a free living stage that finds the plant root that it wants to infect. It goes in, sets up home, and then induces the plant to form a little knot around it to protect it and create a feeding site where it matures and reproduces. The most common nematode we're going to find is the root knot nematode. So I hope we haven't scared you out of gardening by telling you all these guys that are out there fighting you for your garden. Hope you learned a lot about entomology, how to identify insects and the different pests that can be in your garden. But don't give up hope. Module 10, we're going to tell you about all the good guys that are out there helping you in your battle against the bad guys. So be sure to visit the website to post your questions and your lab results, and we'll see you in Module 10.